Gotta unmute there. There we go. Hi there.
Hello.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Doctor. I actually don't think I've ever asked you to pronounce your last name in person. Now I'm afraid to do it on a live stream. Would you mind pronouncing your last name for me?
Now I want to hear it. You got to attempt.
I'm going to go with Azuakor. Did I get that right?
Close.
Okay.
It's Christine Zwakor.
Izwakor. Okay. That makes sense. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Izwakor. We got a really exciting topic to talk about today. I get asked this all the time, which was super surprising in my journey as a cybersecurity professional. I get asked about insurance probably more than any other singular topic when I talk to small businesses as it relates to cyber risk. That comes up all the time. Do you get the same thing a lot?
Yeah, I do. I feel like cyber insurance is probably one of the key drivers right now for small businesses when it comes to cybersecurity in general. So yeah, we're seeing the same thing.
Awesome. And just for our audience's edification, comments are live and we can see them. So if you have a question as we go through today's presentation, just go ahead and throw it in the chat, and we'll be taking breaks throughout the presentation to address those and hopefully give people some good insight on this topic. So let's go without further ado. Let's go ahead and dive in. Today's topic, and we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves at this point, but just for everyone's edification, today's topic is, are you in Cyber-Insurable? Why it's harder than ever to get coverage, keep coverage, and get your claims paid. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Logan Edmonds. I'm CEO and Chief Security Officer at TTS. TTS is a small business cybersecurity provider. We specialize in the SMB. Our particular focus is usually with companies under 200 employees. Everywhere we have clients as large as 5 employees and clients as, almost in the thousands, right? Like, it's a very diverse field we work in. And we basically act as risk advisors in the realm of cyber, helping companies preserve their bottom line. Risk has a very common thing. For every dollar that we prevent in risk is a dollar added back into your balance sheet. That's what we do when it comes to cyber risk. I live here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm broadcasting from. I have a lovely wife and a small daughter. That is Annie, my wife, and my daughter, Addie. Addie is 2, and she keeps me busy. And that's about me in a nutshell. Dr. Christine, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Sure. And thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm Dr. Christine Zwakor, huge cybersecurity nerd and advocate. I've been in the industry for about 15 years now. Earned a PhD in security engineering, spent about 10 years leading different security functions at United Airlines and so on. So through all of this experience, one of the challenges that I continue to see is small businesses, getting targeted by cyber attackers and not really having access to cybersecurity expertise. And so I know we share a lot of that same sort of passion and mission. And so started Cyber Pop-Up, which is a Google-backed company that connects small businesses to vetted and highly skilled cyber experts on demand, especially when they don't have a cyber expert in-house. So we help small businesses of all sizes, mainly folks who, again, have those needs but don't have the cybersecurity expertise in-house or may not have expertise in certain domains. And so we like to put it as, we have expertise across 30 different specialties in cybersecurity. And so we let small businesses get access to sort of enterprise level cyber support without paying those enterprise prices.
Yeah, that's the biggest one, right? Like, enterprise, I don't want to say it's had everything put together. Like, it hasn't, but it's had a much more robust plan with dealing with this topic, I think, in terms of the scale of time than the SMB and the SME has, right? Like, it just felt like in the last 4 years, the SMB space just got, small business, small to medium enterprise just got slapped in the face with this problem, right? Like, all of a sudden, it became a big deal. It went from, oh, here's the Nigerian prince was my idea of the cybersecurity issue to, Colonial Pipeline, no gas in Georgia, right? Like that it almost felt like it was overnight. And it definitely felt like that if you're trying to get cyber insurance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just speaking from experience, I remember back when I started my business, if you're a business between, under $1 million to $3 million in revenue, you go down the streets, your local broker or your local agency, you fill out like a 1-page questionnaire, pay like a premium of like $600 a year, and you got $1 million in coverage. It was great, right? Like, that is not how it works anymore. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a cakewalk compared to what's happening today, for sure.
I miss the old way. even though I know why they changed. And we're going to talk about that today. I will lead today's webinar heartily saying I miss the old way. Safety standards change, right? Insurance companies define new standards when it comes to safety standards. That has been true for the last couple of centuries. Whenever, car standards change, safety car standards change, insurance companies are what dictate how those standards are measured and applied to. You either comply with whatever standards the insurance company has and any kind of coverage, or you lose your coverage. Case in point, it's not just cyber insurance, homeowners insurance. My younger brother, he bought an older house about 3 years ago. He just got notice this year. They said, "Hey, we're not going to reinsure you until you replace that roof." Right? Like you that roof is outside of our specification or we're willing to entertain. You've got to go replace it or we're just not going to give you coverage.
Yep.
Very similar situations playing out on the cyber side of things.
Yep.
Everybody knows this one. You get a ticket, you drive recklessly, you get whatever, your premium goes up, right? We are definitely moving into a world where your cybersecurity management is going to dictate what kind of coverage you can get and the cost you're going to pay. We actually already have moved a lot into that world. Let's talk about this. I know last time we chatted, you were like, I got to read up on this. Did you get a chance to read up on this court case?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, good. It's a bit of a, honestly, if it wasn't about cybercrime, I almost saw like an episode of Law and Order out of this, right? It's this crazy saga. So Travelers, if you ever had an insurance policy, you've probably heard the name Travelers. They're a pretty big carrier in the world of insurance. Travelers wrote a company called ICS in Illinois. They were an electronic manufacturer for $1 million cyber policy. And this was, I believe, 2021. Does that sound right to you?
Just about. Yeah.
So, spoilers, it didn't go well for ICS. ICS got ransomware. They paid ransom and they had to do cleanup and all this other stuff. So when they went to file their claim, Travelers went back through their cyber insurance application. Let's talk a second about these applications. We mentioned before that the cyber insurance application before COVID, 2019 and onward, pretty straightforward, right? It wasn't that hard. I want you to talk. What's been your stance? How have you seen a recent cyber insurance application? What's your take on it?
Yeah, they've definitely beefed them up a bit. And I mean, rightfully so, right? Like I know some of the people who are filling out the applications may find it a little bit harder, but the reality is when insurance companies were underwriting insurance back then and asking very simple questions, right? They weren't really taking a holistic view on like the risk and like what's going on. And as a result, they're underwriting insurance kind of in the wild, wild west, right? And then they started incurring a lot of, claims and issues and all of that stuff. And so they went from sort of asking very basic or like no questions at all to really being very thorough and asking a ton of questions, many of which a small business has no clue how to answer, right? And so we've definitely seen that shift.
Yeah, they feel almost like an audit. Not quite the same level, but definitely more in the vein of an audit. And they're full of technical questions that the average business owner might not know. Like for a great example of this, how often do you do vulnerability assessments? How often are you doing, risk assessments, penetration tests? Do you have DNS protection? Like I've seen all kinds of stuff. Mm-hmm. And the thing about insurance applications are in the court of law, they're considered a warranty, right? You are attesting to your current stance on anything when you're getting underwritten at this time. So the insurance company uses that as basically a snapshot, right? This is the current risk we're willing to entertain.
Yep.
And it's a pretty high bar for them to argue that the warranty is misattested to. Generally, it falls in the realm of gross negligence. A lot of people would say, this just means the insurance company's out to get you. That's not my argument here. Like carriers generally are committed to the contracts that they put in place, right? Like it's their business model. They know they're going to win some and they're going to lose some. Like that they wouldn't be in business if they tried to nitpick every single claim.
Yep.
But in this case, Travelers went back through ICS's warranty, through their application, and they saw ICS attested that they had multi-factor authentication. Most people on this webinar hopefully know what multi-factor authentication are, but there are 10 seconds or less. Let's go through it. Basically, it's when you sign in with your password, you get some other form, some kind of challenge to confirm you are who you are. It can be as simple as a text message with a code sent to your phone, a prompt on your phone that you have to push. Some of the better ones nowadays give you actual keys that you can plug into your computer and push a button on those. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. ICS attested they had multi-factor authentication, but when the claim was processed and Travelers investigated, they saw like they really didn't. They had it like one or two places, but by and large on their network, it wasn't there. And Travelers said, hey, that's not what we meant in this application. We can think this is gross negligence. They argued that in court and they won. And they also won on appeal. I didn't put that in the slide, but ICS appealed and they lost appeal. So yeah, today's agenda is cyber insurance. The 4 questions we're going to answer. Is cyber insurance necessary? What does 2024 look like as it regards to cyber insurance? What are these new standards? And honestly, what an action plan should look like for a small business that actually cares about getting cyber insurance. Is cyber insurance necessary is the first question. What do you think?
Sure. So, I mean, for me, like, I feel like I can't say anything but yes, right? Like, the reality is, like, we look at cyber insurance the same way that, like, from a car, from an auto industry perspective, which you mentioned earlier, like the same way that every driver has to have insurance, because if you don't, right, and accidents happen, right, there's like your risk, there's your passengers, there's infrastructure, there's other people who could be hurt, and so every driver has to have insurance. And in this day and age where every business, small and large, is basically operating on these digital roads, everybody holds that same risk. And it's not just, your company that gets impacted when you get breached, right? It's your customers and your potential investors, your partners, your employees, so much more. And so having that insurance is just critical to making sure that you can navigate that. As well as, I mean, there's a ton of other drivers that are making it very necessary. But I think overall, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree with everything you just said. You can't, it's almost impossible to operate a modern business without some kind of digital footprint. Case in point, we have a client that's a Mennonite roofing company. Talk about like tech is not what you normally would think. Guess what? They need cybersecurity too. And they're very open about that. Yep. I was just working recently with the municipality, like 7 people on staff, operating budget of $1.3 million a year. I can talk about this because there was a news publication now, so it's public knowledge. Had a phishing attack last month. Remember, operating budget of $1.3 million. The attackers took $719,000 out of their bank accounts, more than half their operating budget. You better believe cyber insurance is necessary to recover from an attack like that, because it's happening. You hear about it all the time.
Yeah, we see it as well.
So yeah, it's a key component. I almost frame it as, in every risk strategy, you got to have a proactive and a reactive stance. Like, how do we mitigate it from happening in the first place? And then if it does happen, what do we do? I think cyber insurance is critical to that reactive side, right? If the worst should come to pass, this is a safety net that every business needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, let's just go through the stats on that. Like, I know we can say that, but let's educate our audience. 53% of small businesses were hit by some form of cyber attack in the past year. We're seeing that rise year after year. It is, honestly, I just don't see any mitigating factors that say that number is going to come down anytime soon. We're in a perfect ecosystem for that. 46% of uninsured SMBs never fully recover from an attack. Now, let's talk about this one really quick, because I don't want anyone to ever accuse us of fear mongering. When we say that, what do we mean, right? I love to talk to people about 2 terms: breach and compromise. They're thrown around a lot in our industry. In my mind, one is inevitable. Another is worst case scenario. What do I mean? I make compromises every day. I make mistakes. I've clicked on a phishing email in my time. I've said a little too much over the phone. I did something dumb without really thinking about it, right? Like, you're never going to stop compromises. They happen. It's okay. We can learn from them, recover from them. Breaches are a little different, right? Breaches are when I end up in the news because someone did something very bad to me. When I use that number, I'm referring to breaches. I think that makes sense to our audience when I frame it that way. Anything you want to add to that?
No, that makes sense. That is, I think, good clarification first.
I gotta be careful here, because I'm like, does that mean if I click a phishing email, I've got 50% chance of going bust? No. That's not what we're talking about here, right? Like, no, we're talking about cyber attacks. So yeah, if you're uninsured, about 1 in 2 is the failure rate we see when it comes to that, because this stuff is expensive. I have an IR division of our firm we run. Our average rate starting out, just to go, if you like a rack rate, if you don't have like a retainer or a deposit for instant response and forensics, we're around $475 an hour. And we're actually considered on the lower tier for that. So it's expensive if you don't have insurance to get someone to come in and clean stuff up. That's not call your local IT provider down the street. I mean, my experience anyway.
Yeah.
60% of executives may decide not to do business with you if you don't carry adequate cyber insurance coverage. That's definitely true for me. Is that, would you say it's true for a lot of other businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. Across the board. I was actually just talking to a large company yesterday about this sort of topic. And yeah, they said that they're very reluctant, if at all, like open to working with a small business if they don't have insurance. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think this is right on par.
All of our contracts have an insurance clause. I think I have to carry between 1 to 2 million in cyber coverage just in business with
It's
half the clientele.
Yeah, it's funny actually. Like when we first formed as an organization, and we're a cybersecurity company, we take this very seriously, of course.
Yeah.
It was very early. Our first customer happened to be like a very large company before we focused in on small business, and they required insurance. And so from like day one, we got cyber insurance for that reason. And yeah, that was quite a while ago.
I love it too because it's like I'm getting more and more of these. What I'm seeing too is people who you wouldn't think would have a big cybersecurity risk now. A lot of hospitality businesses I've been seeing a lot lately. Of hey, I'm working with this partner or this vendor, and they're requiring me to have cyber insurance. So it's definitely starting to spread throughout the industry, even in verticals you wouldn't necessarily assume would be heavily focused on that.
Exactly. I think another thing that we're seeing too is like interest from like even like board of directors or from some of the internal drivers or like investors asking for insurance. I've talked to so many VCs and so many startups and folks who have leaned into it for that reason too. So I think there's a couple of different drivers that are pushing that as well.
Yeah, if you're in biotech right now and you're trying to get VC backing, which it's already a bit of a challenging thing. We have several clients in VC backing biotech sphere. Like every single investment agreement has a cyber insurance component, around 2 million, as I've been seeing across the board. Like they just don't want to run that risk, and I can't say I blame them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a risk to like your business. It's a risk to your investment. Like so it's understandable.
And yeah, also too, right? We're seeing regulations come down the board too. The new FTC safeguards was a big one that passed this past year. We're starting to see enforcement on that, and that basically mandates, for all practical reasons, to carry some kind of cyber coverage.
Yeah.
If you're an investment broker at this point, I mean, a Charles Schwab, for example, if you're a Charles Schwab investment broker, I know for a fact they require you now, if you're going to be under the Charles Schwab banner, to carry cyber insurance. You cannot operate your investment brokerage without it.
Yeah. One thing I'll add to maybe a last one is there's regulations that are requiring sort of like restitution or like payments be paid in the event that something happens. And so we see small businesses also gravitating towards insurance to try and help with some of that cost too, because it can be pretty overwhelming and unmanageable without it.
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised to hear it, like even on a state level. Like every state has data breach laws now. So if you get impacted, we're seeing more enforcement from that, where the state actually enforces its data breach laws on the books saying, okay, you are required to not only notify everyone, which has costs of itself, and give them reasonable course to find out what was impacted, but also credit monitoring, some kind of financial recompensation, the PR costs. Like it does add up. Like a policy is kind of critical for, you don't want to pull that kind of money out of your operating budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And that enforcement piece is key too, because I think people put out a lot of different like information and requirements and all of this, but until it really starts to get enforced is when people pay attention. And I think that's a wave that is happening right now as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, so honestly, the last thing we will say too, and I gotta be careful with this one. So I think it's important for us to mention we are neither of us licensed insurance agents nor attorneys. So at the end of the day, whatever we say, run by your insurance agent, run by your attorney. That is our disclaimer here. This is just what I am seeing in the wild when people say, hey, I have a cyber insurance policy, right? If you have something like an errors and omissions policy, a directors and officers policy, right? There's things that business to business professionals often have. I have an errors and omissions. Do not assume that you have a cyber insurance included with that. More often than not, one of two things in my experience has happened. Again, not an agent, but this is my experience. Either you don't at all, it's just not included, it's completely waived, or it's a very little, tiny itty bitty amount of coverage that doesn't actually realistically cover anything. Generally, what I've been seeing when you have sufficient coverage, it's almost always written as a standalone policy. That's been my take.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree. I think today we see a lot of cyber insurance mainly as a standalone or as an add-on to an existing policy. However, I do genuinely believe, we're not there yet, but I do believe that in the future, like this is going to become so integrated into business insurance that I think I hope we get to a point where it truly does become a part of the just overall business insurance policy. But yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on today because it's usually not the case.
I agree 100%. It needs to get there. I think probably the problem is, as we mentioned, it's a wild west right now. The carriers are just trying to figure out how to contain it and control the risks that are involved in it. And so for the moment, from a logistical standpoint, that's how they're playing the role is we have to put this in its own little parcel because it has its own rule book attached to it. Eventually we get it standardized. Yeah, it needs to come back under the business umbrella. Let's talk about the cyber insurance market. Cyber insurance carriers in 2020 took a beating. I know it's been 4 years, but 2020 has been imprinted on my, or sorry, 2020. Yeah, I got that right. Is imprinted on my brain for a lot of reasons. One of the things I thought was interesting is I had cyber insurance in 2020. I was with Lloyd's of London. They dropped me. They literally took such a beating. They said, "Hey, you're a cybersecurity company. You have other businesses. You're gone." Like they sent me a letter and said, "You got 2 weeks to find another carrier."
Oh,
I remember that, and I was like, "Really?" Like I had no claims. I had knew nothing. They just flat out dropped me. And now looking back, I get why. Like they, like 114% carrier loss ratios. Those are staggering numbers for any kind of policy.
Yeah, that was an unprecedented time. Like, yeah, I remember talking to carriers around that time, and some of them were just like bleeding out. And so, yeah, and so kind of the notion of firing customers or like figuring out how to offset some of that risk became very real.
I mean, I have a buddy of mine who sells cyber insurance. He is an agent. He has a saying that I will steal every day long, which is insurance at the end of the day is just the most sophisticated form of gambling known to mankind. Like carriers are just very complex gamblers. They have very good algorithms. And in this case, they just didn't know how the rules of the game were played. Like the entire game changed and they didn't understand the rules. So they were just trying to figure things out. Yeah. I think that was an apt description of the situation we were in.
I would agree.
Premiums went skyrocketed. I used to pay, I mean, I can share my own policy number roughly. I used to pay, like I said, like $800 for a policy. That same policy became in premium money for the same exact thing with the same exact coverages and a lot more legal red tape. I think it went up like 10x for me. I was almost $4,000 a year at one point, and now it's even more than that. We saw premiums skyrocket the last 2 years. Does seem they've plateaued a little bit across the board, but I have also heard from various people in the know that they're probably going to go up again next year. Also, the amount they're covering, like in terms of general things, this new thing called a supplement for cyber policies kicked in. Coverage went down. Do you want to kind of talk about what a supplement is on that? Are you familiar with that term?
Supplements. I mean, I think in general, there's a lot of like limits and exclusions that have been added into things. So, for example, right, ransomware is, I think, the leading category of or like source of losses for insurance, cyber insurance companies, and it has been for some while. I think for small businesses specifically, something like 35% of the claims that are submitted are ransomware. And so you'll see things like, there'll be $1 million overall policy limit, but if it's extortion or something like that, the limit is actually only 100,000. And if you don't pay attention to like those little like sublimits and those kind of things in between, then yeah, you can get caught off guard when you think you have coverage and you really don't.
Yeah, I same thing with business email compromise, like right, that almost always results in some form of financial fraud when someone hacks an email. So what I've seen a lot of is you might have $1 million aggregate, but you'll have a sublimit for financial fraud where money's taken from somebody's account either through fraud or through some kind of social engineering for a quarter of that, because they need to reduce the most frequent flyers to make this profitable.
Yeah,
I get it, but it's not good. A lot of people don't realize that.
Right. Yeah.
Carrier profitability is up right now. It's slid a little the last years. It's working, but it has slid in the last years. It's not quite as much as it used to be, but we're seeing the premiums are now offsetting the losses. And it really just does come down to the policies are more expensive and they have less coverage. And because that's what works in this environment. I'm not demonizing the carriers in any way, shape, or form. It's just that there's no carrier that can operate on a net negative long term. They have to make a profit. So
yeah, no, sure. Yeah. And I think it highlights again the stuff from the slide prior. I think there's so many new and creative exclusions and things that are included, not necessarily because these carriers are trying to be malicious or like get out of paying some of these claims, but it's just to really try to understand the environment and figure out how to just manage that risk. Like you can't continue to increase premiums indefinitely. I would hope not. And so at some point that has to flatten out and you have to continue to manage it on the other side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You say that and I got a pit in my stomach. I'm like, I really hope not. I mean, so this is a lot of scary language, a lot of high level stats, right? What does the market changes mean for the people watching this show or watching this presentation? I mean, it really does boil down to what we were saying. Higher premiums, lower coverages, and the requirements to get the coverage in the first place are going to be more stringent. They are watching, they are monitoring, because at the end of the day, the carrier has to make a profit. And again, that's just how it works. So what do we need to know about let's talk about the underwriting standards. That's going to be the meat and potatoes of today's thing, right? Like what's different. I mentioned previously that it used to be pretty darn easy to get cyber insurance. They really didn't ask any questions. It was for me I'm a what's called a managed service provider. I think my warranty was literally, do you have a contract in place with people? Like, do you write contracts? Do you have antivirus? Great. Here's your insurance policy, right? Like that was literally the requirements. That is not how it is now, especially if you're trying to get first time coverage. If the carrier has never worked with you before and has no record of a previous policy, they do tend to make you go through several hoops. Also, too, if you make a claim, what's been your experience with? Have you worked with people who've made claims on their cyber insurance policy and then renewing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've worked with a couple, and it's like either the premium is heightened like all the way up, or they're not able to renew at all, right? Which that has its implications, because when you think about it, like if you take a step back and think, like a lot of these companies are buying this insurance for contractual obligations with vendors and things like that. And so it's like when you end up with some of these claims and you can no longer renew your insurance, it's not just a like, oh, that sucks kind of thing. It's like, no, you're in breach of contract potentially with some of them with vendors, and what implications does that have across all of your vendors, and so it can get very complicated very quickly. And so I think that's an important thing to call out in terms of what some of these like shifts mean for people, because that often gets overlooked.
I 100% agree. Like cyber insurance, in my opinion, should be treated as a nuclear option. Like we need it, we have to have it, but it should not be something you want to trigger, or even hopefully will have to trigger in the short term, right? Like I can't say you can ever guarantee you won't do it, but once you do it, once you trigger that claim, you're going to have a bear of a time getting renewals, whether it's going to be more price, or what I've also seen from that same thing you said is they either pitch like a stupid premium, right? You go from like $6,000 a year to $30,000 a year, or they only offer you less coverage. Like they'll still raise your premium, but instead of a $5 million policy, for example, they'll say we'll give you up to $2 million, but we're not going to go.
Yeah, I see that as well. I think another thing that you brought up a good point on is like, that's part of why like it's so important for this to be a backup plan and not like the primary risk management strategy, because when it is your primary strategy and you do eventually like run into some kind of issue, you end up probably worse off than you would have been if you just focused on some of the proactive things that can be done. And so I think that's another piece that's important, especially for the small business segment. Like one thing that we've seen, an interesting stat in the industry related to this, is small businesses make up about 30% of the cyber insurance industry, but account for 98% of the claims, which is like madness, right?
That doesn't surprise me. I mean, when we work with a small business customer, now the first thing I'm doing is if they have cyber insurance, I'm calling the carrier to say, hey, I'm working with you and setting up that relationship, because I know my small business customers are going to be the ones that are going to be, well, let's be honest, the most likely to have to go down that road. It's the thing is like, when you file a claim, you're going to go under the gamut. Let's start there. Like any insurance, when you file a claim, you're not getting your money the next day. Look, your homeowner's insurance. I filed a homeowner's insurance claim in my house like 3 years ago because of wind damage. It was 90 days, 2 inspections, and I got like a third of what I wanted, right? Like that was what the claim was. Cyber is very similar in that, like when you file a cyber claim, the first thing that's going to happen in 24 to 72 hours, you're going to get on a phone call with the representative from the insurance carrier. And then after that, with a breach coach and some kind of forensic team. What is those two things? A breach coach is a lawyer that specializes in data breach law, especially in your area and your regulatory stuff. And a forensics term is not someone who's doing proactive stuff. They are running an IR team. They're that $450 an hour team, and they're going to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. That's somewhere between 60 days to sometimes upwards of 120 days, depending on the complexity of the breach, how much time it takes to gather to do the work. Like, we've done a couple cyber claims in our time. The one that we saw about a year and a half ago from beginning to end, that was about a 75-day timeline for them to get any kind of payment. And they lost about a quarter of their operating budget in that breach. So they were stuck running their business with like a quarter less cash on hand for, what is that, 2.5 months?
Yeah. We've seen similar. We had one customer who, prior to coming to us, unfortunately, like they went through a breach and it wiped out quite a bit of revenue that they expected to come in, and they had to downsize by almost 90%. Despite having the insurance and everything, I think going through that process and the time that it takes when you're really like constrained in your resources as a small business can really have that impact.
Yeah. So this is what we're getting at. If you're going to do a claim, you need to have proper due diligence as you manage your proactive side of your risk. I have to be careful here because I know we talked a little negative about cyber insurance, and still go back to our original point. We do think you need to have it, and we do think it plays an important role, right? Like this is not cyber insurance is terrible presentation. We promise. This is you actually do need to consider how it plays into your risk profile and how you do stuff. So when you get cyber insurance, what part of the role of your cyber risk plan does that fill? It fills, I'd say, the catastrophic area. Right? Like it is a last resort against catastrophic failure. Yep. And in order to make sure you have that last line of defense against catastrophic failure, you got to have a little bit of due diligence. You need to be proactive about some stuff. This is a worst case scenario, but it has happened. And we just got to remember that there has been court precedent set now for a carrier when they went to someone who they considered grossly negligent. Again, that's the key phrase, grossly negligent. They voided the coverage. The carrier is not a blank check, and they don't want to be treated that way. They want you to carry your fair share of the risk profile, and that means doing a little bit of proactive work. So that's the question, right? What exactly does that mean? What is due diligence? What are you talking about? Fair. We're getting there. Here's some of the stuff you're going to see when you go to an insurance application more often than not. They're going to want you to have something like an actual firewall. If you're a small business, no using the Spectrum or Comcast box for your main router, right? If you have an office, have a proper firewall in place. You need to have MFA, multi-factor authentication, turned on a plethora of things, your email, your bank accounts, wherever you can, really. If you're a kind of business that's handling, and most businesses are, is what I found, whether they realize it or not, a lot of personally identifiable information, PII, that's phone numbers, email addresses, day of birth, social security numbers. You need to have some kind of plan of how you manage those. And there needs to be some reasonable risk reduction in there. Encryption, we talk about that even in the mainstream world, is a very important thing. If your computer is encrypted and someone steals it from your office, guess what? Yeah, it sucks. You lost your laptop, but at least they can't get to the stuff that's on the computer. You need to have that. Some kind of anti-malware, and we talked about ransomware. You need to have backups and you need to test them. These are just some of the things that we're seeing. Does this line up with what you're seeing?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I think these are a lot of the basics that are really important. I think when carriers are asking these questions, they're oftentimes trying to get a sense of especially for the places they're seeing the most claims coming. So we talked about ransomware, we talked about business email compromise. What are the fundamental things a small business or any policy holder should be doing to avoid those things? Because we don't want to see those claims come through, because that's what is making us bleed out. And so a lot of these drivers are for that reason, to validate that you're not going to expose them to those kinds of risks. And so, yes, we're definitely seeing similar.
I would put the term as undue risk, right? They know they're going to absorb some risk.
Right. Yeah.
That's the name of the game, but they're not going to, it's sort of like the best insurance policy I can compare this to in my experience is hurricane insurance, right? If you live in one of the southern states, you're going to get hit at some point, right? It's just inevitable. But there are certain things that you're required to do to get flood insurance. You need to have certain kinds of ceiling on your houses. You have to have the coverage to a certain carrier, right? Everybody who lives in a southern state knows you don't mess around with flood insurance. You need that, and there is things that are required of you. This is a very similar risk profile and how they're addressing it. Hey, we'll absorb the risk that can't be accounted for, but there's some basic competencies we expect you to be proficient in, or at least have somebody available to you that can be proficient in it for you.
Absolutely.
That's what we're seeing a lot of. Yep. And yeah, you have to be in a position, and this is the other thing I think a lot of people are too, they just kind of assume, well, I think I have these, so I'm good, right? If you can't prove it in a relatively orderly fashion, remember this, when you're running in chaos, when you file a claim, your state of mind and your state of your business tends not to be in the greatest shape. You need to have a plan to quickly go through and prove that you have all this stuff. Yeah. Because that's the first thing they're going to ask you file a claim. Okay, did you have anti-malware? Can we look at the logs? Did you have multi-factor authentication? Can we look at the logs? That they're going to ask this.
Yes.
And you got to be in a position where you're ready to answer.
Yep.
Again, remember ICS. It lost, honestly, because, and I think this is really the truth, I don't think Travelers would have won that court case. Again, not a lawyer, but looking at it from my dummy perspective, if ICS could have proven they were implementing MFA in good faith across the board and some kind of tracking, I don't think they would have lost that court case. I think it just came down to is they said the insurance has got this and we're not going to deal with it. Check the box. And that's the difference between gross negligence and honest mistake. So insurance will cover honest mistakes. Like that's honestly half the reason it exists. I've read a general liability policy. Half of it involves me falling off a ladder on somebody's property.
This reminds me, between this story and some of the recommendations on the prior slides, it reminds me of like the old like BitPay case where they also got denied. Have you heard of that one?
It's ringing a bell, but refresh my memory.
Okay, yeah, I'll just be real quick. So BitPay is basically a cryptocurrency startup based in, I think, Atlanta or so, who they lost $2 million in a payment. I can't remember like exactly how that hack happened, but they lost $2 million. They went to their insurance to get a claim for this. And how that played out is they got denied because the how the money was lost is one of their third parties got compromised and sent a bogus email to them and they wired the money. I think that's what happened. And so basically it was the third party that got hacked and they ended up being the ones to lose the money. And the way that the insurance was set up is that, hey, you technically didn't get hacked. Your third party got hacked and then you got duped into this. And so the reason why that came up for me is twofold. I think one, just on the notion of really understanding what the insurance covers, but then going back to like what you need to have in place and what you need to be able to prove and some of those things. I think the third party element of both doing third party risk assessments on yourself, but then also understanding the third parties that you're working with and the way that they can impact your security and how you can impact theirs, because that's a whole nother like beast of just complexity and concern here. And so I think that's another thing that we got to keep a close eye on.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I can provide maybe another example here too, which is I did an insurance claim a while back with a nonprofit that had coverage for like $500,000. And what happened was they experienced a business email compromise. Their financial administrator's email account was hacked. The hackers read through all the emails. They figured out the nonprofit had a contract with an engineering firm to like reduce like a add-on. I think they were doing like an add-on to like a historical site. So they need like an engineering firm to figure out how to do it without damaging the site too much. Well, the hackers read through the contracts. They figured out roughly when the first milestone of payments were due. And they managed to impersonate the engineering firm. They had like an email that was one letter off or something like that and divert $115,000 in liquid cash. They convinced the administrator to make 3 separate payments. And again, using they had like invoices with the right templating and like it was a very, and again, the timeline matched up with the contract. Like this, all the boxes were checked. Like they didn't set up any immediate red flags. Well, they of course figured out they were duped. They filed an insurance claim. About 60 to 75 days later, the insurance claim came back and said, yeah, you have $500,000 in coverage. But other than the money that you lost, because you weren't properly recording the logs, because there's no evidence that there was more damages done against you, we can't find evidence this hack has actually caused damage. And you have a sublimit in your policy of $15,000 for financial fraud. So that's all you're eligible for. So they paid $15,000 and left the nonprofit with $100,000 back. Yeah. And I do to this day stand by if they had done a little bit of due diligence, because we kind of helped them out on that one in terms of like recording things with some proper tooling or even just having policies in place. A, they probably could have prevented that. But B, they would have had a much better chance to argue back against the carrier and say, hey, no, I think there's some damages we need to talk about here and kind of get a little more money out of that. Yep. Just don't assume, I guess, is what we're saying. Don't assume.
Yeah, exactly.
I like, so that ties into the main thrust today. Periodic third-party risk assessments is imperative. Most small businesses do not have the in-house expertise to create a viable roadmap to how to achieve this kind of compliance and risk management. They just don't. And to be honest, I don't think it's fair to expect them to. Like they have their own focuses, their own disciplines. So a third-party risk assessment can go ahead and paint a path for you, not only on what your current risk profile is and what your most likelihood of where your risk is going to come from, but also if you have gaps for, let's say, insurance, they can paint the picture of how you achieve bridging those gaps so you don't have to worry about it. Give you the plan of action to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. A lot of times from a business ownership perspective, I know you get it and I get it too as CEO, good data is imperative. I can't make a good decision until I have like good data in front of me that I can understand and make actions on. And that's what a third-party risk assessment does. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does a couple of things. Like for us, one of the most common statements that we hear over and over and over again from small businesses is, "I don't know what I don't know, and I don't know where to start," when it
Mhm.
comes to cybersecurity. And that is a totally fair statement. Like we don't expect everyone to be cyber experts, and so I think the best answer to that is not throwing a firewall that only covers one area and not the other, right? That's how you end up in some of these situations. The true like first step is to do an assessment and really understand, what your current like risk posture is, like where you are and what you can do, and ideally in a language and in a model that is small business friendly, because I know there's a lot of very complicated frameworks and all kinds of things out there, and so really doing something that is right sized for small businesses, especially, is important.
Yeah, and one more caveat to this whole thing. If you do have an IT guy in house, understand they are not a cybersecurity or risk assessment professional, right? Like a lot of small businesses, especially when they hit like that 25-50 mark, say, we'll just go have our IT guy tell us what to do. And I get that impulse, right? But information security and cyber risk is not the same thing as IT. Are they intertwined? Absolutely. But self-assessment, just like it's asking my IT guy, hey, are we good? Right? Like, again, they don't know what they don't know. And it's not reasonable to expect them to be an expert. And let's be honest, it's not their chosen discipline most of the time.
Yeah.
IT is a different discipline than information security.
Yeah, we're also seeing some concerns with even those folks around like the liability or the pressure of like, hey, now my name is on this assessment, or now I've done this, and it's going to cause us to not get claims paid out, or it's going to cause us to like do X, Y, and Z. And so I think there's also this sort of hesitation, and rightfully so, of people who are not deeply ingrained in cybersecurity expertise, who prefer to get that true expert help versus trying to wing some of these things that are so critical on their own.
Plus, it's not fair to the IT guy. Like, I feel so bad. Like, I've talked to so many like solo IT department guys, like the one guy in the organization, and you can just tell the amount of pressure they're under. Like, they get enough of it to know, holy crap, I'm being set up to fail.
Right.
like, and I feel so bad for them on that call. I'm like, I don't. I wish I could talk. Like, that's usually half the conversation is just hearing their trauma.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, it becomes like therapy and like a complete vent session. I sit through them all the time.
So, I mean, yeah, learn the new standards is, I said, the action plan here. You need to understand that cyber insurance is not the same as it was 5 years ago. You need to have some kind of plan to fulfill the new standards. And I personally, it depends on your organization, depends on your risk posture. But one of the things that we do for our clients, we run quarterly tests, right? Like we just check on all the things that we have in their security framework for their insurance and say, like the backups, great example. Once a quarter, I'm going in, and my team is, and saying, hey, if they have some kind of backup, have we tested it? Right? Like, is that working the way it's supposed to? Hey, we turned on multi-factor authentication. Somebody turn it off. You'd be surprised. That does happen from time to time. We turned this on, right? Why is it off? Oh, so-and-so over here turned it off. No, don't do that.
Right.
You need to have a way of evaluating on an ongoing basis to make sure you're not caught your pants down. And then once you have all this stuff in place, you can get the right coverage. You can get the right price for said coverage, because more and more carriers are going to be willing to take you on. And you also know what fine print to look out for. A lot of this is not rocket science. It's just knowing what to look for. A risk assessment can point you in the right direction to getting started, and having the right expertise. I know Cyber Pop-Up offers it. We offer it, that can advise you when there's key decisions that need to be made, so you know where to look. That's all businesses really need. Like, entrepreneurs are smart, right? Like I'm very rarely, if ever, met an entrepreneur who's successful who isn't wicked smart. Right? Like that is part of the deal. I get it. But also, it's like we said, it's not their discipline. So if they don't know, hey, go look under that rock, why would they look under the rock? This is what we're telling people to do. So here's our special offer. And hey, I said we were going to be done at 3:45, and it is 3:43. We're killing it on time today. Our special offer is for the first 7 people that go to this QR code. The URL is also in the banner beneath here. It's cyber.tabernacle.tech/quiz. We are giving away a initial risk assessment. What does that mean? It is about, I would charge about $500 to answer these questions for you, just because it took me a serious amount of time. I'm rather proud of this one. I actually went back and redid our risk assessment inquiry, but it gives you a good idea of where your current risk posture is. Now, let me asterisk this. This is not the same as a full risk assessment. A full risk assessment is very detailed. There's discovery. We're going to ask questions, but it's a good way to get the pulse on maybe some of the areas you should be looking at in your business that, ironically enough, if you get cyber insurance, we'll also ask you the same thing. So if you go ahead and scan this QR code and fill out the form, the first 7 people, we're giving this away free of charge and no questions asked. Again, cyber.tabernacle.tech/quiz. Okay, we're down to the final minute of our presentation. Anybody has any questions? We haven't gotten anything yet in chat, so I'm assuming we've done a pretty good job, but we're going to go ahead and take 60 seconds here. If you want to put something in the chat, answer questions. Do you have any takeaways or keynotes that maybe we didn't talk about so far that you would communicate to our audience?
Nothing that we haven't covered yet. I would say the biggest takeaway is cyber insurance is important. Buy it, absolutely. But also don't try to be a cyber expert on your own, and make sure that you have the right expertise in your corner to do, whether it's that assessment or actually implement some of the controls and things that you need, which can also sometimes save you on your premiums and things like that. Do that. Of course, like Logan mentioned at Cyber Pop-Up, we're happy to help in all of those areas as well. So yeah, I'm always open. Reach out.
Absolutely. And I'm on the same thing. My key takeaway here, I think, and I know it sounds a little biased coming from us, but I think it's absolutely true. Cyber controls and cyber insurance should not be treated as expenses in your business now. They are a cost of doing business. You need to have them because it's sort of like not having health insurance, right? You can run that dice if you want to, but the moment that comes up snake eyes, you're in for a world of pain. So again, I know I'm biased, but I would say for the entrepreneur, for the small business, for the leadership team, you're going to need to start preparing in your budget for higher insurance premiums and a little bit of risk reduction in costs there, because the way things we did a while ago just aren't working anymore. And it's a new world we're entering into.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we've got nothing in the, oh wait, hang on. We got one thing. Let's see. Underwriting standards PII was listed. Would you please review what that was a question. Oh, wow. We're getting some questions in. Okay. So hang on a second. Let's go through these. Yeah. So the PII standard, so underwriting standards PII. So they're going to ask you, do you have personally identifiable information, which most organizations do. I'm just going to be honest about that. I've never done a full risk assessment where I haven't found some kind of cache of PII. That's been my experience. And then if you do, they're going to want to know, okay, how are you safeguarding that? Are you using encryption? Are you controlling who has access to it, right? Some kind of access controls. Generally, they want to see that you're not just putting a bunch of personally identifiable information somewhere where anybody can get to it and you're not keeping track of it. Because that's the stuff that's legally, it's like legal kryptonite. But no, that's not the word I'm looking for. Kryptonite's not the right word. Like legal radiation. I don't really know how to best frame this. It's the thing that a lot of data breach laws and state data breach laws are centered around is PII. So they want to, since they're the ones going to be paying the bill for any kind of compliance stuff, they want to make sure, hey, again, you're not being grossly negligent of how you handle it. Jerry Musak asks, do you direct prospective clients to a good cyber insurance company or just coach them to work with their broker? That's a great question. So neither me nor Cyber Pop-Up sell cyber insurance. It's not our jam, and that's not what we do. That being said, I do have a couple brokers I usually refer to who are cyber insurance focused. It is a unique kind of policy. I've heard horror stories. I've never experienced them directly, but from colleagues, I've heard horror stories of working with agents who just don't normally write cyber and don't understand what they're doing for the prospect. So you answer your question, I would refer off the top of my head, there are 2 companies, and I can go ahead and put them in chat, but I generally refer people to a brokerage called Inskyber or another brokerage called Fifth Wall Solutions. Those are my 2 default guys. Andy Runyon and Mike Hauser are the guys over there running them. They're doing a great job. I've never been started around by them. And if you come to me saying, hey, where do I get $1 million of insurance? I would point you to one of those 2 guys. Do you have anyone you would like to add to that for like a cyber brokerage or any information on that?
Sure. Just real quick, yeah, we pre-vet a couple of small business friendly brokers that we tend to work with. Founder Shield is one of them, for example. But then the other piece is we partner with larger cyber insurance carriers to offer their policyholders like free cybersecurity resources and things like that are sponsored by the carrier. And so that's another piece that as we work with our customers, we try and loop into the conversation, because again, like anytime a small business can get their cybersecurity services subsidized or like covered in the least sense, then that's always helpful as well. So I'm happy to chat offline or share more about that if there's
And can they go to your website at Cyber Pop-Up to learn more about that? Would that be the best place to go to?
Yeah, absolutely. Just submit a contact us form. We can get in touch.
Same here. If you guys, I always direct people to our website, because just submit a contact form and we'll point you in the right direction. That was a great question. Do we have any others? Or we I want to make sure I'm not rushing. I think we're about 30 seconds behind real time. So I might give it another minute here if that's all right with you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I don't see any others in yet, but happy to stick around.
So, but that was a great question. Yeah, I get it, because with insurance brokerages, insurance agents, insurance carriers, they all specialize in different things. So generally, whenever you want the best policies or the ones that are the best in your sample, you want to work with somebody who has experience in that area. Oh, Jerry, thank you.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
No. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say I've talked to quite a few carriers and folks at this point, and I think that's one area that we've seen opportunity and like agents and brokers like getting up to speed on cybersecurity and being able to really support their clients in that space. So I know there's a lot of conversation around that going on as well, and it's something to ask about and like look for like as you think through like who you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is fair to say to agencies, brokerages, and carriers, insurance typically is a relatively slow-moving industry, right? Like they don't pivot on the drop of a hat. And cyber has just changed so rapidly over the last 5 years that it's not reasonable to expect them to understand the industry 100% yet, right? Like they usually do things over a 10, 15-year interval of measures. And literally in the last 5 years, it's changed 5 major times. Like that's one of the biggest challenges I think finding a good partner in that sphere is finding someone who's able to keep up with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we have for now. My name is Logan Edmonds. I'm CEO of TTS.
And Dr. Christine Swalcor, CEO of Cyber Pop-Up.
Thank you guys for joining us. Have a great weekend. Stay safe out there, and don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us if you have questions. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.